morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, coming back at you with another Archon's Armory. Today we will be talking about Genestealer and Tyranid weapons. And while I've done videos on both Genestealer armies and on the adversaries of Tyranids, this is just a nice third video for all the Xenos folks to tie things in a even little bow. Let's get right on to Mythos. Unique or intentional weapons. So, this is a little bit of a question. A lot of the designs that both Tyranids and Genestealers use are special, or otherwise not represented in other factions that should logically have them. For a lot of reasons this is. On the side of the Genestealers can use basically anything that humanity has produced. A vast majority of them are capable of using human-type weaponry, and so the folks at GW have developed for them some unique or special weapons. On the side of Tyranids, the weapons that Tyranids develop are pretty much all a process of evolution. They are morphs, they are biomorphs, they are biological organisms that the hive mind has selectively bred to create weapons, essentially. So they are intentionally designed, but a lot of them are actually the result of genetic drift, and it's something we'll talk about later, how certain of X weapon may not look the same as another morph of another weapon, and they may have different upgrades or evolutions as the hive mind continues. Genestealers and or Tyranids, or Genestealers or Tyranids. The video is bifurcated, as you will notice with the art. On each one is a Tyranid piece and a Genestealer piece. That is specifically because I will be talking about both the things that they share, the weapons that they share, and the things that they don't share, what is specific or unique to each faction. Then, shared purpose, different methods. Now, the Genestealers are the infiltrators. They are the foot troops. They come into the galaxy long before the Tyranids arrive, and they are a thorn in the side of humanity so for a great length of time before the Tyranids even get there, even though the Genestealers are a species, subspecies, or some sort of morph of Tyranid. They come from a Tyranid creature, the Patriarch, and they are organized and assisted by Tyranid creatures such as lictors. So, they are Tyranids, but they are a specific subsection, Genestealers, so not all Tyranids are Genestealers, but all Genestealers are Tyranids at their core. Size difference and effective limitations. Obviously, most Genestealers don't get bigger than human size, which means that a lot of the weapons that we'll be talking about will be very specific to a certain faction. I'm speeding this along because not only have I done a video on both of these factions before, this is a double upload, so it might be a little bit quicker than you're used to. So, it'll still be well over 40 minutes because God forbid that I ever make something shorter than almost an hour. Reality of Genestealer and Tyranid weapons. We have living organisms. So these are the biomorphs that I was describing. These are things that are either attached to the Tyranid, like these claws here, that is living and developing like a nail from the creature itself, or, a little bit more commonly, you get weapon creatures. Now, what are weapon creatures? These are literally a subspecies of Tyranid. They are a biologically slaved, basically animal, literally an animal, almost a birthing animal or bug that is being used by the Tyranids for this process to become a weapon. Now, you'll see what I mean with a lot of different weapons, but these are separate from the entity using them most of the time, meaning that a Tyranid holding a gun is actually a living creature holding a living creature that is often completely sentient, or at least partially sentient, and it is acting as a birthing ground for the quote-unquote ammunition a vast majority of the time. So, for Genestealers, you have stolen or locally sourced weapons. You can see in this picture here, a lot of them are using blades, either cult blades or spears, very standard auto guns. You can see a couple of las pistols and a couple of auto pistols, but all of these are human weapons that the Genestealers have stolen or otherwise sourced from human habitation. So, all of these are taken. They're essentially not created by the cult unless they're produced underground, but they get weapons and equipment the same way that Chaos cults do by stealing from Imperial Society. Claws, teeth, and blades. This is in both. So, the Genestealer side of things, they have the pure strain, the boys up here with their big hooked claws, their teeth. They have a second pair of arms that I believe either have hands or more claws. There are certain other Genestealers like Acolytes, who their fingers kind of terminate in 3 claws. And then Tyranids, for the most part, will have both claws on all of their hands, and they will have big scything blades or claws that act like lobster claws. So, these are fairly common, and they are relatively uniform as far as, like, it's a secondary backup melee weapon, and it is used by creatures that don't really need the ranged weapon as much, or they're like the pure strain, and they're just really basic and not necessarily all that smart. And they are in direct contact with the hive mind a lot more. So you see this with things like Raveners, some warriors have it, but the ones that are smart enough to use ranged weapons will tend to use both claws and ranged weapons. Bioacid, poison, plasma, psychers, venoms, kind of both, maybe just acolytes. So, bioacid, poison, plasma, psychers, these are in both. There are psychic individuals amongst both the Genestealers and the Tyranids. The Genestealers rely on them a lot more than the Tyranids do. Venom is something that can come in both forms. You know, theoretically, some Genestealers can develop minor mutations that can allow them to produce things like poison or bioacid or venom in their bodies. Usually this is just the Acolytes. Sometimes it will be the pure strain as well. But that is more related to what hive fleet that they're from, and it might be something that they gain via genetic drift, which we will talk about later. The other side of this is bioacid, Tyranid poison, and bioplasma. Bioacid is essentially exactly what it sounds like, essentially stomach acid or some other type of biological acidic material, and bioplasma is that heavy acidic material, that like liquid vomit, basically. It's acid, stomach acid. It is that material heated up to a very high temperature. So it is an acid that is basically at near evaporation point. It is extremely hot, and it is melting through material at much higher speeds because the acid is super excited. Now, this can get to insane temperatures on the levels of, like, sublimation or becoming a very, very hyper-hot gas, but it will immediately condense on a target and acidically burn through it very quickly because the acid is superheated. So, like boiling water can burn skin, bioplasma will take acid, heat it up to an incredible level, and then strike a target with it. So, again, this might be a thing that Genestealers will use. It depends upon the morphs and upon genetic drift, you know, what they absorb, what genetic material they take from the creatures or from the people living there, and of course, Tyranids can produce it and make it inside of themselves, but more often than not, it's a Tyranid thing. So, pros and cons of Genestealer and Tyranid weapons. We have some lovely Acolytes up here. They got the 3 arms, they got the claws, and they have weapons and lashers and things like that. We have some nasty Tyranids down here. We got a Moloch, Tyrannifex, and a couple of Gaunts. And then we have a Magus here, giving some orders to what looks like an Aberrant and some second-round Genestealers. So, I'm going to do one for each side. So, on the side of Genestealers, they have pretty lackluster armor penetration. So I'd put that as a con for them. Their weapons are, again, based on human types, but even their most basic, most common weapons are going to be auto weapons and cult daggers or blades. At best, these are going to be mono weapons, but more often than not, they're going to be standard primitive weapons, just made to be like these, you know, curved, stabby cult blades. There are some that have slightly better, but a majority of them are just going to be pretty neutral or basic with armor penetration. On the side of Tyranids, this is a little bit more neutral, but I would say that most Tyranid weapons, their biomorph ones especially, can penetrate light body armor pretty efficiently, unlike Genestealer weapons, which tend to not be able to do it as well because, you know, stub weapons. But Tyranids are just a little bit better, which is why I'll put that as neutral for them. Rate of fire. Now, on the Genestealer side, they actually win out on this, because they have a lot of machine guns, they have a lot of light machine guns, heavy machine guns, their auto weapons can be fully automatic, and they tend to have a lot more universal firearms. On the other side, Tyranid weapons are very pulsating. They're very requirous that their ammunition grows and develops inside of the weapon. It does grow fast, but it's not instantaneous. So they can resupply themselves via increasing the growth rate of the living weapon that's attached to them, but it does mean that the number of fully automatic weapons that aren't like a spray of acid or something like that is pretty non-existent. So pro for the Genestealers, con for the Tyranids. Ammunition supply. This is going to be a con for the Genestealers, pro for the Tyranids, swapping around. So on the Genestealer side, they do actually have to supply a lot of their stuff. They might be limited in how much they can actually get access to because they are dealing with human storages and human weaponry, so they can run out of ammo. They're not necessarily producing it themselves. They're having to steal it from storages, and more importantly, their weapons are going to be of much more various calibers and types than the Tyranids, because the Tyranids, their weapons are biomorphs. They are able to produce more ammunition inside of themselves, and as a result, they will effectively never run out of ammo until the Tyranid no longer has enough biomass to continue producing ammo, at which point they will probably either eat the gun or return to the spawning pool to pick up more biomass, or shove themselves into a giant hole and let the biomass eat them and recycle them. So, pro for the Tyranids, con for the Genestealers. Range. So, for both of these, it's actually a con. Genestealers generally will only use pistols for a lot of their units. Some of them do use rifles, but again, these are auto rifles. They have some level of accuracy depending on the design, but they are definitely not pinpoint accurate, and a majority of the people using them are totally untrained and relatively human in terms of recoil management, reaction speed, and strength. So, con for them. For Tyranids, many of their weapons are relatively short range just because they're not ballistically sound. They are shooting things out via pressure mechanics. So, if you've ever seen, like, a valve shoot something, or, like, a ball with air coming behind it, like a ping-pong ball held up by a leaf blower or something, it is similar mechanics to that, where it's being pressed or pressured in a direction, rather than being expelled by an explosion. Now, it can be an expansion of gases, but that expansion is not nearly as quick as those of a firearm, just because they are limited by the biological valve and expansion system within the creature itself. It will naturally be considerably slower than an actual firearm, which means that its range will suffer. They're not ballistically stabilized. It's not a bullet, it's a creature, and those are usually going to mean that short range is the best that you're probably going to get out of them. The bigger weapons obviously have much longer range, but it is still not something that Tyranids will generally be outranging any other forces. Damage effect. So, for the Genestealers, this is a neutral one. They're using fairly standard weaponry. They're using fairly standard equipment. Some of their melee weapons are better, but, you know, in general, pretty neutral there. On average, par with every other force that they're going to be fighting against. For the, same thing for the effect on target, actually. They're just pretty generic or neutral in terms of their damage on target and on their damage effect. For the Tyranids, on the other hand, they have a lot of poison, acid, secondary effects, and of course, all of their living creature weapons have a secondary effect on striking the target. So, the damage effect is pretty neutral. You could argue that it's a slight con based on the size or weight of the weapons, but I think the really big pro comes in the fact that their weapons have great effect on target. Not necessarily on armored targets for the reasons that we talked about before, but on different infantry targets, they definitely have a lot of variety in their effects, so I'd put that as the major pro, and damage effect being either a minor pro or a little bit neutral. Now, the damage effect for Tyranid weapons will change, obviously, as bioacid, plasma, poisons are applied to them, but Tyranid poison is not as virulent as other poisons in the galaxy because they are biological and require us that they can be inside of a living creature. Many poisons are not. Many of them are limited based on how much damage the creature can actually sustain. For example, if you have a creature that produces acid, it cannot be, vulnerable to its own acid, so that could limit the virulence of the material. Numbers, advantages, and disadvantages. On the side of the Genestealers, they do rely upon numbers a lot. So if the Genestealers don't have the numbers for an uprising, they're going to lay low. They will not enter into open warfare unless it's to protect the Patriarch, and at that point, if they are on the defensive foot, they don't really have anywhere to fall back on. They will just die out and fight to the last man. That's basically it. Now, on the other side, when they do get to the planetary invasion size, they can be very dangerous because they are sending out a giant MK Ultra signal to everyone to go and attack and do the preordained plan that they didn't even know was in their head. So, big advantage when there's a lot of them, kind of piddly, not really good at all when there's not a ton of them. So, there again, it's a little bit of like an exponential increase, but the big thing comes with the Tyranids. Tyranids tend to never, ever deploy in small numbers. Again, there will be thousands of Tyranids just at the start. You can't really catch the Tyranids without a lot of bio creatures because even their ships are bio creatures and are filled with bio creatures. So unlike the Genestealers, where you could theoretically catch them on the off foot and catch the Patriarch lacking, essentially, Tyranids you cannot. So they don't really suffer any of the disadvantages, and then they have the major advantage of the more Tyranid creatures there are, the more biomass they consume, the more variety they have, the better the Shadow and the Warp gets, and the better the synaptic connection between them becomes. With the Genestealers, you could argue that the more complex creatures, the Neophyte generation, make it so that they have better control over their troops, and that is true, but it isn't necessarily a universal thing that those will be present, or that they are necessarily any better in large numbers than they are in small numbers. So, why Genestealers and Tyranids together if they're so different? It's because they actually deploy together a lot of the time. So, Genestealers will go and soften up a world. They will launch a campaign, no matter how ready they are, when the Tyranids show up. The Tyranids will come down, attack from the back while the Genestealers are attacking from the front, essentially pincer whatever resistance is on the planet, and then they will eat all of them. The Tyranids will eat the Genestealers and the humans alike, and the planet will be consumed by the Tyranids. Generally, this is done from orbit via big old sucker tendrils. The planet's atmosphere is condensed and made very hot and nasty and liquid. All the living material, the biomass, is collected and created into flesh pools. The flesh pools then are sucked up like a long sippy straw from Tyranid ships in high orbit, and that's how the planet is then consumed and basically left as a rocky husk filled with a bunch of dust and crap. So, they deploy together. That's why. Logistics and logic section analysis. I know I'm going at this as a fast clip, but let's be honest, the Genestealer video was already one of the shortest videos on the channel, and I'm going to see if I can beat that record for being slightly more efficient. I do love Genestealers and Tyranids, but I've already done a video on both of them, so this is going to be a nice change of pace to get things a little bit quicker out, so, you know, people can use this as a shorter reference. So for Genestealer weapons, they are Cultist Plus. And they are they are the art on the entirety of this slide, so let's go into it real quick. When I say Cultist Plus, it means that they're stealing a lot of weapons, so they're going to see a lot of autoguns, you're going to see a lot of stuff stolen from the guard. You can see this gentleman here is grabbing a weapon from a guardsman, yeah, that's probably a guardsman, and he's taking his autogun, he's taking his ammunition. You can see some damaged tanks in the background. A lot of them are going to steal from them. The other thing is industrial weapons. So you can see that this dude has a big old saw, not a power saw, but essentially a circular saw that he's using as a weapon. These guys here, they have those cult blades, the kind of curved daggers. These weapons, these kind of more specific Genestealer blades, it's not clear whether these are some sort of power or psi weapon, or whether they're just generic weapons that have been doped with poison or acid. Any of those are possible, but I'm pretty sure that they're not regimented, as in not the most common things ever. A lot of them are in the hands of the primus of the leadership of the Genestealer cults. The acolytes tend to use a lot of daggers and stuff, but these smaller guys tend to comfort themselves with stubbers, heavy stubbers, autoguns, things of that nature. Pistols are very common. Now, moving on. Things that are technically extant in both of them. Unique psychic disciplines that are reliant upon them as an extension of the Shadow and the Warp. So, we already talked about in the other videos how these work a little bit, but the Tyranids, they have a more aggressive form of the Shadow and the Warp that comes with them, and their psychic disciplines can be a lot more aggressive than the Genestealer ones are. The Genestealers have lots of psychic individuals, but their disciplines of psychic power is not as offensively aggressive. It's not lightning, it's not exploding things, it's not blowing people's heads off. It's more distraction, hallucination, confusion, essentially ways to give their troops a massive advantage over enemies who they wouldn't normally have an advantage about. It can freak people out. It can scare them. It can make them uncomfortable. It can make them see things that aren't there. And essentially, it allows them to extend the little bit of the shadow in the warp that the Genestealers produce and have the same effect upon their enemy. So, claws and teeth. There are several types of claws and teeth. You get the lobster claws and crushers, which are on the next slide. I'll talk about them. You get scythes, again, next slide. I'll talk about them. You get trad claws, the XL trad claws, and the triple XL trad claws, or the double XL trad claws. Trad claws are essentially like these. They are three-pointed, they are hooked, and they are designed like fingers to grab, rip, and rend. They are used on pure strain, they are used on gaunts, they are used on termagants, that's what their hands are generally, and all of this essentially is just a backup melee weapon. Sometimes it's a backup melee weapon to a backup melee weapon, but still, it is essentially ensuring that even when a Genestealer isn't armed, they can still be dangerous, and it's one of the reasons why Genestealers, the pure strain, are so deadly, because they have 4 sets of these claws, 4 sets of these claws. The XL and double XL are pretty much limited to Tyranid creatures, really big ones. These come in the scything form or crusher form, but they also come in the smaller hooks for termagants or for gaunts, and other ones that we'll talk about when we talk about other biomorphs, or you can go into the adversaries and look at them there. Bioacid and bioplasma. So this is acid and superheated acid. So I don't think that the Tyranids are producing actual plasma inside of their bodies. That is not really physically possible, considering that in the lore, every single piece of a Tyranid creature is theoretically drawn or originally drawn from another living creature. Producing plasma is not really possible, but producing superheated acid, like something like the bombardier beetle creates. So the bombardier beetle, if you don't know, it creates 2 different types of very aggressive substances in its abdomen, and then it puts them together, and it not only becomes very acidic, it also increases in temperature. It's an exothermic reaction, and it sprays out of it, and it can blind you, it can burn your skin. That's what I think bioplasma is, because we see it a lot, kind of burning away skin, lighting people on fire almost, or like smoking and boiling away flesh, where bioacid does traditional acid things, and it melts down, anything. It will melt down parts of your body, it will corrode steel, anything like that. Bioplasma just increases the temperature of that acid, makes it far more aggressive, and in theory, allows it to be sprayed a much greater distance because there is an ejection. The bombardier beetle actually has a portion of its body blown open by this reaction because it's exothermic and it releases an increasing amount of gas. The bioplasma creation in things like the exocrine literally creates a huge amount of pressure, and then there is this bulging explosion or expansion as a valve is essentially tripped inside of the creature, and it sprays this splurt of superheated acid out of it. Biomorphic weapons. So these are the maggot, bug, and beetle guns. These are wombs, almost, that a Tyranid creature will haul around that has living creatures in it, either maggots, bugs, or beetles, and a spray or a jetty of gas is shot into the weapon through a tube, and then it is sprayed at a target. Essentially, these little larval or lower-order creatures that live inside of this object that is an artificial womb for them, or has become their womb due to Tyranid interference, develops them and shoots them out as weaponry. So, speaking of which, let's go through our images here. We have a big old Carnifex, I believe, or possibly a Screamachilla, but I think that's a Carnifex. He has lobster claws. I did not talk about this in the Tyranid video, and I wish I had. Lobster claws are kind of a mod on the traditional Scything Talon, where the Scything Talon, as you can see up here with the Carnifex, and he has 2 up above, kind of is like a pick or like a scythe, where it's intended to do one thing. It's intended to drop right down and stab with the tip or with the leading edge and cut into the target via sheer impact force. The lobster claws are designed to grab and crush. So very much like a crab or something like that, it grabs an object, usually an armored vehicle or an armored enemy, and crunches down on it with pure strength. Wrecking balls are another thing that can exist with Carnifexes specifically, but it is essentially a similar thing to that. It's just a living growth of tensioned tendons and wiry muscle and things like that attached to a bunch of spiky shit. Now, going down here to another one, we have the Scythes. Now, these Scythes, this is, I believe, a Lictor, possibly... No, that's probably a Gaunt, actually, just like a really big, nasty Gaunt. These are really long, and they're essentially designed to both have a cutting edge and to have a very long reach in comparison to the standard, shorter, like, talons, or like the rending claws or blades like that. These are designed to attack from one angle. They're not very good for dueling. They're not very efficient for long-term combat. You know, you can't slap these things around. They are relatively thin. They are tough because they are made of chitin, but they are relatively thin, and they're not self-healing like the Bone Sword is. These are very common in a lot of different Tyranid forms, but you can also see here the sickle or hook claws. These are used to hold a target in place while you're stabbing them with another weapon. These do require a good level of precision, but you can see here the way that a Gaunt would want to use them. This might also be a Lictor, but I think it's a Gaunt. Might want to use them is to absolutely push all of their muscle back and then come down towards a target with the very tip, aiming to push directly into them, stabbing through or forcing their way through whatever armor they can find. Down to the bottom here, we have the Rupture Cannon, one of the largest biomorph weapons and one of the best in the Tyranid arsenal. This essentially fires a seed pod, or a creature pod, at very high speed, so it's got a ton of pressure built up behind it, and it fires this little pod creature. Now this is as hard as steel, and it essentially embeds itself within the target. You know, it'll hit a tank, and then it'll cause a small dent, and it will smash into it, and then upon touching the vehicle, essentially upon impact, this creature that lives inside of this seed pod or egg pod will split open in the direction of the tank, and like a Hesh round, it will split open towards the direction of the tank and then spray a bunch of acid. So it will pop, essentially, in the direction of the armor and spray a bunch of superheated bioplasma, or just crack and pop and send all of its very hard exoskeleton into the tank. So it has kind of a smashing kinetic impact, and then it secondarily explodes or pops or detonates with either bioplasma or acid, spraying the dented, damaged section and theoretically penetrating it. Down here we have the Exocrine. This is a secondary creature on its back. Its gun is actually an entire other creature, while the little one here is just kind of a weapon beast. This is that one that I was talking about. It induces a chemical reaction that causes extreme heat, extreme pressure, and creates an acidic solution that it then continually heats up, containing this exothermic reaction until a valve trips and it spews a giant ball of bioplasma off into the distance. The Venom Cannon up here is one of the very cool weapons for warriors, one of my favorite ones. It fires a beetle, and it is one of the beetle guns. So, a beetle gun essentially fires a little, very angry insectoid creature. What does the insectoid creature do? Well, it has little claws, and it smashes into the target. It digs its way in, it kind of scrabbles at the target angrily, and then it explodes, shooting a bunch of acid around itself. So, it fires basically a softball-sized ball of knives in this angry beetle creature. That beetle creature digs its way into the target, and then it pops, spraying all of the damage that it did and the target with acid. So, very deadly 1-2 punch there, effective against a lot of different armor types. The Flesh Borer, the Flesh Borer and the Barbed Strangler are similar things. Same with the Spine Fist. The Spine Fist is essentially a pneumatic dart gun. The Gaunt just huffs really hard. The Termagant huffs, and it pushes out a bunch of needles covered in poison. These are not great for armor penetration. They just kind of spew at the target. The Barbed Strangler, it has flesh hooks. Again, a lot of these are pneumatic, so it builds up pressure, and then it shoots out this length of material. These ones, the Barbed Strangler hooks around a target and wraps it up, slices it, does all that kind of nasty stuff. The Flesh Borer and the Devourer both have similar jobs, but they do it differently. The Flesh Borer shoots a single bug, and it scrapes into a target a little bit, and then it just explodes with acid. So, it's like the Venom Cannon, but a lot smaller, and the bug does a lot less damage. So it kind of grabs the target and then pops, making sure that the acid hits the target, whereas the venom cannon actually shoots something that begins to actually cut at the target. So the flesh borer, it kind of hits and then pops. The barbed strangler shoots out, grabs, and then rips at or pulls back on the target. The devourer shoots a whole bunch of maggots that eat flesh. So again, that pressure thing goes through. It sprays a little splurt of maggots at the target. The maggots take onto any empty flesh or onto any material that they can find. They begin to eat away at it, and then they die. So these can dig into human flesh. They're relatively easy to stay away from if you just have like some solid coverings over your body. The devourer won't really hurt you. They do not live forever, so they can't just keep eating away at you. The impaler cannon, similar to the barbed strangler or to these flesh hooks down here, or the unknown thing over here. The impaler cannon is used by warriors. It is much bigger. It shoots into a target, and there's also another version that electrocutes them, but this one just shoots at the target, pulls back on them, or is like a crossbow, and it poof, shoots out a very solid chitinous barb at them. Again, all of these are living creatures that are effectively expelling things as a result of their natural processes. The bone sword is another one that is semi-sentient. There's a living creature in here. It produces this chitinous plating. It is a very sharp blade, but the main factor with this is that the semi-sentient creature within the hilt is producing a small kind of force field or psi-active disruption field. Now, this is not strong enough to be considered a power weapon, but it can protect the sword from a lot of damage and increase its amount of killing power. You know, it is just a bone cleaver, but because it has this projection around the blade, it can keep it from being chopped through too quickly. It can keep power weapons from just slicing right through it, and the sword can slowly regenerate itself. That might be the fastest that I've ever gone through all those weapons. Oh my goodness, I did a good job. So, users, importance, and logistics. Do huge fleets matter more than genetic diversity/drift in both forces? So, on the side of Genestealers, I think genetic diversity matters a lot. The Genestealers are not consuming targets like the Tyranids are. So when you consume a human, whether you infect them or whether you turn them or produce a new biomorph, genetic diversity and genetic drift will affect you dramatically. A Genestealer who infects an abhuman is going to produce abhuman offspring or abhuman-like offspring, whether they are infected or whether they are used to create new Genestealers as the new generation. But with Tyranids, they're much closer to having an arsenal of genetic material. So, when a Tyranid hive fleet consumes a planet, they will keep certain advantageous adaptations and continue to develop them from that. Unlike Genestealers, who are kind of forced to accept genetic drift and diversity, the Tyranids can fight against it to a greater or lesser degree. And then they can also develop a lot more quickly and change tactics. You can see that here with this Ravener. He's got a whole bunch of different weapons. Essentially, these would be developed from other living beings that he has eaten or that the hive mind has consumed and then produced him. So, types of Genestealers and Tyranids to weapons. Genestealers tend to only use certain weapons on certain people. Bigger, heavier weapons tend to go to Acolytes or Aberrants, while more standard stuff uses more standard infantry weapons. But the Tyranids, there's a lot more stratification. Bigger weapons, bigger claws, more capable ranged weapons, especially the more armor-piercing weapons, require dedicated creatures whose biological components are specifically designed to take and use those weapons. For example, the Exocrine is basically entirely developed to produce bioplasma. The Hierophant is a frickin' titan, and it has all different types of modifications to specifically produce bioplasma and a ton of acid and poison. A lot of the poison is going to come out of the Tyranid themselves. They will produce it. So, it does matter a lot more for Tyranids what type of creature it is than it does for Genestealers as to what weapons they're equipped with. Especially weapons for specialty Tyranids. So that's what I was referring to with the Tyranids will have a lot of weapons that are designated armor piercing or specific to them based on the morph that they are. So if it's a Ravener, they're going to have all melee weapons. If it's a warrior, they're going to have half melee, half ranged. Termagants versus Gaunts, range versus melee. They're just going to have this variety that they can call in or develop or produce based on the amount of biomass available and based on the requirements of the campaign, in addition to whatever was left over from the hive fleet coming in. So, Biological, Bestial, and Psychic weapons. Both of them use psychic powers. The Tyranids are a lot more aggressive. The Genestealers are a lot more just confusing. The Genestealers tend to not have as many biological weapons, but as I said with Genetic Drift, some Genestealers can develop things if they are pure strain from the fleet that they came from. They could theoretically come with modifications given to them by the Hive fleet, but more likely than that, Genetic Drift can kick in, and Genestealers can begin to change to fit the population that they are infesting. Theoretically, this could be things like skin color, eye color, height, breadth, width. They could be stronger, they could be taller, they could change a lot of ways physically, but the only really special ones, things like producing poison, acid, having spikes, anything like that, that's probably going to come more from the Tyranid side of the ancestry than the infested people side of the ancestry. And the final thing is Bestial. A lot of these are just big, bulky creatures that have, like this guy has, no complicated morphs or anything, no specialty stuff. He just has a genetic gift from the hive mind that allows him to create man catchers, nasty bladed coils. He's grabbing some piece of metal here, the big ball of metal and spikes. All that kind of stuff is going to come down to just they're developing as like animalistic response to anything else. And that also applies with when the Tyranids are beaten and the hive mind is thrown off, Gaunts and other Tyranid forms will revert to a bestial form. Whew, I think that might be the fastest one. I'm trying my absolute best to keep these at a reasonable pace. So, as mentioned before, please vote. We have Tau adversaries incoming. This has been a great double upload. I was glad to get it done. We have a Knight Armory video and a Titan Armies video coming next. But Tau adversaries is first, because somebody asked how to kill the Tau. I will do them. Then Knight Armory, which is going to be talking about all the weapons of the Imperial Knights. We will touch on some of the designs, but they don't matter as much. And then Titan Army. So, between the Tau adversaries and the Knight Armory and Titan Armies, I might do the video for Archive, because it seemed like a lot of people wanted the Fields video, and I think I should do that before I do Knights and Titans. So, Tau first, then the Archive video, then Armory, then Armies, and when I talk about Titan Armies, I will talk about how they deploy, all the different types, and when I go over Knights and Titans, I will talk about Chaos. And then after that, we will go through the cycle, and I will start giving you guys 4 options for what topic you want, but we're going to be going in a cycle from Armory to Armies to Adversaries, and then to Archive, and essentially each upload, I will give you guys a vote on what subset of that type we want, but we're just going to do that same order of Armory, Armies, Adversaries, Archive. Lovely memes here. I am a big fan of this one. I like Chapter Master Gene Angelos of the Bloodstealers. That is hilarious. But I hope this was a good video. Sorry it was so short, but I've got 3 videos on these guys now. I hope you can jump around to them, and if I need to revisit it, I will. But y'all take care now, and I wish you all a lovely good night.